moral virtue. And I have this question, is love part of our answer to the question of how we ought to live, right? This question of what is it, how should we live, where does love and what conceptions of love fit within our understanding of our answer to that question? And second, I am technically a political theorist, a political philosopher, so I'm also interested in the direct political question, what is love as a civic virtue? And the question I have to explain that, is love part of our answer to the question of how we ought to live politically? And obviously those two are interconnected in various ways. So keep those in mind as well as we go forward. But today, we're going to engage these ultimate questions in a particular way, and those of you who know me won't be surprised what that way is, and that is by way of James Baldwin, thinking with James Baldwin. I've spent I don't know, at least a decade now, thinking with James Baldwin every single day, and I'm always trying to get more people to do it, so you get to be the victims today of thinking with me, thinking with Baldwin. Baldwin is somebody who is really important to me. I'm working on Baldwin all the time, and thinking about Baldwin all the time, and I think that Baldwin is one of the, as the advertisements for this talk indicated, I think he is one of the great philosophers of love to ever roam the earth. And so I want us to think with Baldwin about love. And this question, why Baldwin, there's no one better to answer that than Baldwin himself. So we are going to attempt some high technology here. And I'm going to play a clip of Baldwin talking about love, among other things. I'll rewind it so we don't miss anything.
The world is held together, reading is held together.
Great. We'll try that one more time. Thank you, James. There we go.
Love has never been a popular movement, and no one's ever wanted to be anything free. The world is held together, really it is held together, by the love and the passion of very few people. Otherwise, of course, you can despair. Walk down the street of any city, any afternoon, and look around you. What you got to remember is what you're looking at is also you. Everyone you're looking at is also you. You could be that person. You could be that monster. You could be that cop. And you're to decide in yourself not to be.
All right, so in that clip, right, just about a minute long, you have Baldwin talking about love among so many other things, and I think you can just by watching that 1 minute worth of James Baldwin talking about love, you can get a sense of the weight of the idea for Baldwin. Like, love is at the center of his philosophy. Now, I have a second interactive activity for us, just to keep the blood moving, and that is this. You have on the back of your Valentines, also produced by the child labor of my beautiful daughter Luna, she used her little glue stick and put little James Baldwin quotes on the back of the Valentine. So I'd like you to take a look at those for just about a minute and share them with those around. You can even trade if you want to, and just take a minute and just talk about the quote, read the quote, talk about it with your neighbors, because you have different quotes, many of you. So take a minute to do that, and then we'll come back together. All right, let's come back together. And if you didn't get a Valentine, don't lose hope. You could get one from a friend later on today. And don't throw those Valentines away. I don't want to see them in the recycling bin when I'm leaving. I want you to go keep it forever, put it in your scrapbook, or maybe you should give it to somebody later today. You never know. But I want to I will refer back to these quotes, and I may call on you or ask for your help later in the presentation to remind us of some of these quotations. But I just want, since many of you have different ones, here are a few that I want to just put out there. These are from James Baldwin, different writings and interviews and that sort of thing. Love is where you find it. Simple, but profound. Love takes off the masks we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. Societies never know it, but the war of an artist with his society is a lover's war. Love is a battle. Love is a war. Love is a growing up. If we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. Love makes a mockery of the will. I love America, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. All right, so you can get, that's just a little bit, right, of some of the things that Baldwin had to say about love, and we'll come back to each of those in one way or another. All right, so our journey together today, at least as I envision it, I really wrestled with Baldwin this week and trying to figure out, the last couple of weeks, trying to figure out how to do what I'm doing right now. So we'll see if it works. I told Dave, I said, I don't know if this will work, but we'll try. And I have it all came together just in the last hour or so, I think, in terms of how I think this journey will go. I want to talk a little bit about Baldwin's roots and some of the things that happened early in his life. Some of these, the first part of the presentation will be focused on his relationship with his father and his relationship with one of his best friends, Eugene Worth. And those are going to be difficult, and I have actually some trigger warnings in this presentation that I will, and I'll just sort of say them now, just so everyone knows that they're there and can respond accordingly. In the Jimmy and David section about his father, I will talk about abuse, emotional and physical abuse, and so I want to flag that. And then in the discussion of Jimmy and Eugene, I will talk about suicide, and so I want to make sure that those things are noted. And then we're going to have what I'm calling a bridge from this first part of the presentation, which is going to deal with some really difficult moments in Baldwin's life, and a bridge to Baldwin's establishment of himself as a lover. He wanted to be, he thought of his conception of what an artist was as a lover, a particular kind of lover. And there's a bridge we're going to build to that idea of Baldwin as lover, by way of his mother, Bertus, by way of community in Harlem, and by way of a mentor of his named Buford Delaney. And then we'll talk about a couple applications of the idea of the artist as lover, his first two novels, and then this idea of Baldwin as a sort of warrior poet, and then we'll just wrap it all up. And so there will be time for questions and conversation for sure, but that is the vision that I have for us today. Okay. So Baldwin was born in Harlem in 1924, and he is the oldest of 9 children. This man pictured here on the left of the screen is David Baldwin. It's actually Baldwin's stepfather. He never discovered the identity of his biological father, but so he refers to David Baldwin as the only father I ever knew, so I'll just refer to him as Baldwin's father. And that pictured there is Harlem of the 20s and 30s, the sort of Harlem of Baldwin's youth. And I just want to say a few things about David Baldwin. And Baldwin, James Baldwin wrote a lot about his father over the course of his life, both in fiction and nonfiction. He's this figure that he really grappled with, and I think this idea of what love is, in some sense, is developed in the shadow of this really complicated relationship with his father. And so I just want to say a few things about David Baldwin to give you a sense of this man. David Baldwin is part of one of the great migrations. He comes from New Orleans to New York in search of a better life. But what he finds in New York is sort of just a different kind of nightmare. Baldwin says later, James Baldwin says later about his father that the central fact of my father's life is he could not feed his children. So David Baldwin has a life marked by poverty. He has a life marked by where he's a victim of discrimination and racism. The millions of details of every day Baldwin describes later. The landlady, the landlord, the insurance agents, the police officers, and so on, communicated to people like Baldwin's father that his life did not matter. And so Baldwin describes his father coming to accept what the world said about him. So part of the story that Baldwin is he's watching his father sort of eaten alive by despair. He concludes that his father came to believe what the world said about him. And that's a central fact. And what that manifests itself in a couple ways in the life of David Baldwin. First, he comes to hate himself and then treat all those around him with cruelty and asperity. And so there's one line that just sort of captures this so powerfully for me, and it's this. In the essay Notes of a Native Son, James Baldwin says, "I can never remember a single instance when any of my father's 9 children were happy to see him come home." I mean, all that sentence right there just says it all. Now, one of the things that David Baldwin did to the other part of his sort of the armor such as he had it to defend himself against this cruel world was his religiosity, was his piety. He was a deeply rigid religious man. He was a lay Pentecostal preacher, and that's a central part of the upbringing Baldwin has is in the sort of, under the iron fist, as it were, of a very tyrannical father. I want to give you a couple of examples of the ways that those aspects of David Baldwin's life manifested themselves in James Baldwin's childhood. So here's one passage about his father from a book Baldwin wrote, mostly a film criticism, called The Devil Finds Work. "My father said, during all the years I lived with him, that I was the ugliest boy he had ever seen. And I had absolutely no reason to doubt him. But it was not my father's hatred of my frog eyes which hurt me, this hatred proving in time to be rather more resounding than real. I have my mother's eyes. When my father called me ugly, he was not attacking me so much as he was attacking my mother. No doubt, he was also attacking my real, unknown father. And I loved my mother. I knew that she loved me. And I sensed that she was paying an enormous price for me. I was a boy, and so I didn't really too much care that my father thought me hideous. But I thought that he must have been stricken blind if he was unable to see that my mother was absolutely beyond any question the most beautiful woman in the world." There's a lot there. I want to just sort of leave that, and we'll come back to it in a minute when I talk about Baldwin's mother. A second story I want to share with you is from Down at the Cross, which was Baldwin's famous essay that becomes the major part of The Fire Next Time that he publishes in November 1962. So this is an encounter that Baldwin has with his father when Baldwin's in high school. So now I'm quoting Baldwin again. "My best friend in high school was a Jew. He came to our house once, and afterward my father asked, as he asked about everyone, 'Is he a Christian?' By which he meant, 'Is he saved?' I really do not know whether my answer came out of innocence or venom, but I said coldly, 'No, he's Jewish.' My father slammed me across the face with his great palm, and in that moment everything flooded back. All the hatred and all the fear and the depth of a merciless resolve to kill my father rather than have him kill me. I told my father, 'He's a better Christian than you are,' and walked out of the house." Baldwin, in this part of Down at the Cross, goes from that description of that scene I just read to a description of his life in the church. So one way in which Baldwin did follow his father is that James Baldwin became a minister. He became a young minister in Harlem's storefront churches. From the age of 14 to 17, Baldwin was a preacher. And in many ways, he said he bested his father at his own game. He was a bigger draw than his father was. But Baldwin describes the experience in the church, and I just want to use this as a transition point. He describes his experience in the church as, in some ways, as an extension of the experience he had with his father. So he goes from that passage I just read to describing his disappointment with the deep spiritual hypocrisy he found in the church. So here's what he has to say about that. I just want to read a short passage just on the next page of that essay. So he's talking about the hypocrisy of the church as he found it. I don't refer merely to the glaring fact that the minister eventually acquires houses and Cadillacs while the faithful continue to scrub floors and drop their dimes and quarters and dollars into the plate. I really mean that there was no love in the church. It was a mask for hatred and self-hatred and despair. The transfiguring power of the Holy Ghost ended when the service ended. Salvation stopped at the church door. When we were told to love everybody, I had thought that meant everybody. But no. So those are a couple of, I think that is one shadow that I want you to have in mind. You'll see in a minute how this will be on the other side, right? When we get across that bridge, we're going to come back and deal with this shadow, but I want to just leave that shadow hanging over us for right now. All right, so scene 3, I guess. What about love? And again, I just want to note that this part of the presentation will deal with the suicide of one of Baldwin's friends. So, Baldwin's father dies in 1943. And that's a crucial moment in his life, and he will go on to grapple with his father's legacy later in writing, and I'll talk a bit about that. But I want to talk about another shadow that sort of hangs over this story of thinking about Baldwin and love, and that is his relationship with a guy named Eugene Wirth, somebody he meets in the early 1940s. And what you need to know about Eugene Wirth by way of background is Eugene is black, he is beautiful, and he is radical. Baldwin is attracted to Eugene as a person. He wants to spend time with Eugene, and Eugene wants to spend his time engaged in radical politics, rent strikes, protests, this sort of thing. And so Baldwin joins the Young People's Socialist League because he wants to hang out with Eugene. So the two friends are together in a diner. So scene 1, you have 2 scenes with Baldwin and Eugene. And scene 1, they're both in a diner. We can make it the same diner. So scene 1, I want to set up in this way. You have these two young men in the diner sitting across from each other, and the energy is positive. They've come from a protest, and they are feeling excited, and they're feeling hopeful. These young guys in their 20s. And they start talking about all sorts of things, and they're drinking coffee, and they're eating pie, and they're having a great time. And they start talking about love. And I'm going to draw from some of Baldwin's reflections on Eugene and what follows. And Eugene starts talking about a love interest that he has at that time. And then he surprises Baldwin with this. Eugene says this: I've wondered before if I might be in love with you. Baldwin's face registers surprise before masking the shock of recognition with a smile, and then he changes the subject. Now, what I'm going to do now is something I don't usually do, but I'm going to read you something that I'm working on right now that has to do with this scene, and the second scene I'm going to describe for you in a minute. So this is the kind of work in progress I'm doing on Baldwin and love, and it's broken up into these little segments I call meditations about these different moments in Baldwin's life and writing that have to do with this concept. So here's me writing, and I'll try to let you know when I'm quoting Baldwin. In that moment, Jimmy did not really hear Eugene. He heard the words that left Eugene's lips and traveled to his ears, but he did not really accept the weight of the words. After it was too late, he came to understand these words, an oblique confession, he said later, and a kind of plea from Eugene. But Jimmy was not prepared to heed this plea. I wish I had heard him more clearly, he wrote under the weight of decades of regret. But I was to hurt a great many people by being unable to imagine anyone could possibly be in love with an ugly boy like me, So you can see the shadow of his father and what he says there. The inciting moment in the second crucial scene in the story of Jimmy and Eugene seemed to be about politics, but it turned out to be about far more than that. Eugene was an idealist. He really thought people were good, Jimmy wrote later, and that one had only to point out to them the right path in order to have them at once come flocking to it fondly in rejoicing droves. Eugene clung to this vision of a better world as Jimmy fell away from yet another faith. So Baldwin had fallen away from his religious faith prior to meeting Eugene, and he says this about this new faith that he was losing at this moment with Eugene. I had lost my faith in politics, in right paths, Baldwin wrote later. This loss of faith led to the end of Baldwin's life on the left in a formal sense, which alongside his falling away from the church led him to conclude it may be impossible to indoctrinate me. On a personal level, this loss of faith created a breach with Eugene, and that brings us to our second scene. So we'll return to that Greenwich Village diner in 1946. Jimmy and Eugene sit across from each other in the same booth as before. The space seems to be dimmer, and the table is barren except for 2 cold cups of coffee. It is winter outside. Snow is falling. There's little life in the streets. Jimmy and Eugene look serious. So now this is a dialogue between Eugene and Baldwin, some of which comes from Baldwin himself, some of which I created. Eugene, I don't know how you could say that. Jimmy, which part? Eugene, that you don't care what happens in this world. Jimmy, all I'm saying is that we need to reconcile ourselves to the fact that at any given time in human history, there are only a handful of decent people, and that one's plan for survival must be based on nothing more fanciful than that. Eugene, I refuse to accept that. Too many people get left behind if we accept that. Your cynicism is rooted in a failure of imagination. Your assumptions are based on people as they are, not as they might yet become under just institutions. Jimmy, and how, pray tell, are you going to get these fallen souls to accept these just institutions that might make them better than they are? Eugene, through the work we are doing every day, they must be shown the right path and they will follow it. Jimmy, with great venom, that's how Baldwin describes the tone of his response, with great venom. You can't be serious. The right path? If there were a right path, one might be sure that whoever is on it would simply be asking to be stoned to death by all the world's good people. Eugene, crestfallen. It seems to me, Jimmy, that you are on a road which ends in fascism, tyranny, and blood. Jimmy raises his eyebrows and takes a sip of coffee. He pulls the cup away from his lips to reveal a wry smile. So too are you, Eugene. One fine day you'll realize that people don't want to be better. So then you'll have to make them better. And how do you think you'll go about doing that? Eugene, what about love? Jimmy, snarling, and again that's Baldwin's description of his own tone, snarling. Love. You better forget about that, my friend. That train is gone. Eugene stares down at the table before raising his head with tears in his eyes. You're a poet, and you don't believe in love. Eugene puts his head down on the table and begins to cry. End scene. So here's what I wrote about that. When Baldwin reflected on this scene decades later, he felt a particular kind of regret. It was not the regret one might feel as a result of dishonesty. When he said these things to Eugene, he believed them to be true. He would come to think later that he was wrong, but that knowledge was somewhere off in the haze of the future. What he seemed to regret most was how he spoke to Eugene, especially given his friend's state of mind at the time. This sort of back and forth was nothing new for Jimmy and Eugene. They had scenes like this before, with Jimmy playing the part of realist to Eugene's idealist. And even when these scenes got heated, they would usually end in laughter. But this time was different. Eugene was not in the right state to take Jimmy on in this way. And as his best friend, Jimmy should have known it. So here's Baldwin reflecting, this is a quote from Baldwin. But though I know now that I was wrong, I did not know it then. I had meant what I said, and my unexamined life would not allow me to speak otherwise. I really did not then, as far as I knew, believe that love existed, except as useless pain. And the time was far from me when I would begin to see the contradiction implicit in the fact that I was bending all my forces, or imagined I was, to protect myself against love. The two diners, end quote. The two diner scenes fit together rather perfectly as pieces in the puzzle that is Baldwin's philosophy of love. In the first scene, the energy between Jimmy and Eugene is expectant, aspirational, and full of the nervousness that precedes revelation. Love seems just within reach, personally and politically. In the second scene, the energy between Jimmy and Eugene seems stuck, bitter, and broken. Jimmy was in the grip of a rage that was nihilistic. I didn't give a damn, Baldwin wrote, what happened to this miserable, unspeakably petty world. Eugene was in the grip of something else, something even more dangerous than that. Over the years, the armor of Eugene's idealism was strong enough to withstand the daggers of Jimmy's occasional cynicism. But on that night, Eugene was especially vulnerable. The reasons for this were personal and political, and of course, these two were inextricably intertwined. Politically, the world had so long stubbornly refused Eugene's vision and despised him for this vision and scorched him for his color. Even Eugene could take only so much. Personally, Eugene heard Jimmy's biting words about the emptiness of love at a time when he was in love with a young white girl, also a socialist, whose family was threatening to have him put in prison. And the week before, a handful of sailors had come across them in the subway and beaten him very badly. Did the parents of Eugene's white lover simply need to be shown the right path? Was love really the answer for what tormented the souls of those sailors? What about love? Ended up being the final question Eugene ever asked Jimmy. While this question hung in the air between them, Eugene took his own life. In 1961, Baldwin began an essay about Americans abroad with a sketch of the life and death of Eugene. Why? One reason, Baldwin wrote later, is that I thought for a very long time that I had hastened him to his death. You're a poet, and you don't believe in love. Baldwin repeats that line. Can you imagine the weight of that thought in Jimmy's mind? Barely 2 decades on this planet, and an utterance he regretted as soon as the words left his lips may have pushed his best friend closer to the abyss of despair. But what did this hideous speculation, Baldwin calls that thought, have to do with Americans abroad? Because it is from the time of my friend's death, Baldwin explained, that I resolved to leave America. Jimmy was haunted and driven by Eugene's final statement, which can be rephrased as a question: how can you be a poet who does not believe in love? Jimmy would never be able to give Eugene an answer, but he would honor his friend's memory by devoting himself to finding one. To believe in love, Jimmy had to reimagine it. To reimagine love, Jimmy needed to survive. To survive, Jimmy needed to leave. All right, so that's end of scenes with Eugene. And we're gonna cross a bridge now. We're gonna, I'm feeling rehydrated, and we're gonna cross a bridge together. So the bridge that we're gonna cross, and we have hanging now above us, we have the shadow of Baldwin's father, and we have the shadow of these haunting memories that Jimmy has of his friend Eugene. And we really have, I think, Eugene's challenge, right? How can you be a poet who does not believe in love? And Baldwin's challenge is to reimagine love and make it into something he can believe in. And so we're going to talk about how he does that. And some of how he does that, the materials that he had to use to sort of build this bridge for himself were already there. He just had to figure out how to use them. And the first part of that story, at least, and there's many parts, but there's three that I'm going to highlight. The first is his mother, Bertus. On the left-hand side of your screen, you can see these amazing photographs of Baldwin with his mother. Mother Baldwin is what they called her, Mother Baldwin. And she was an amazing, amazing person. And there's a lot to say about her. But Baldwin, when he's later on thinking about how he came to understand what love is or might be, or part of what love is, he always thought of his mother, right? You saw in that passage I read when he talks about his deep love for his mother. And his mother was somebody who he thought was an exception. Baldwin saw so much spiritual hypocrisy around him in the church, but he thought his mother was actually trying to live by a commandment, the most important commandment Baldwin thought there was, and that is to love others as I have loved thee, right? And so he sees his mother as the embodiment of the best of what he thinks Christian love ought to be. And that the highest compliment his mother could pay of another person is to say, he's a Christian, she's a Christian, right? In this very pure sense. So whatever one's religious beliefs, right? This is the sense in which Baldwin's mother is trying to operate in this kind of, this sort of human participation in God's love, right? That's what Baldwin saw in his mother. And also, part of that for Baldwin's mother was accepting people with all their flaws. And that proves to be very complicated in terms of the relationship between Baldwin and his father, right? Because that father I described earlier, Baldwin's mother loved that man. And Baldwin had to grapple with the fact that his mother, who he loved so much, loved David Baldwin. And David Baldwin's sort of version of love was one that Baldwin could not accept. But Bertus does provide this idea of love as acceptance, and this idea of love as this kind of agape, human participation in a sort of divine thing that is really important. It's part of the bridge. Another part of the bridge is community. So much of what I described early on to give you a sense of how James Baldwin came to understand what became of David Baldwin, right? The ways in which the world around him led him down this path of despair. What's left out of that story is the community, right? The ways in which the community is resisting, right? All these means of domination that had destroyed David Baldwin, there are these sites of resistance. And I think those sites of resistance are so important to understanding what becomes Baldwin's mature philosophy of love. And so after that passage I read, when Baldwin's describing the lack of love in the church, and the ways in which the sort of the spiritual hypocrisy in the church he thought was not much better morally than what he saw on the avenue, like the avenue, the wages of sin on the avenue, which are going to come up in this passage I'm about to read. Right after all that, he goes on for pages and pages criticizing this kind of world that he saw in Harlem storefront churches. And then he has this amazing transition to a really long paragraph that we would probably mark up in your English classes, like, my God, this is like it's a paragraph that goes on for a couple pages. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I just want to give you a sense of it. So imagine Baldwin's describing his time in Harlem, again, and down at the cross. He's criticized the church, and then he says this, but I cannot leave it at that. There is more to it than that. In spite of everything, there was in the life I fled, the life in the church, a zest and a joy and a capacity for facing and surviving disaster that are very moving and rare. Perhaps we were, all of us, pimps, whores, racketeers, church members, and children, bound together by the nature of our oppression, the specific and peculiar complex of risks that we had to run. And if so, within these limits, sometimes achieved with each other a freedom that was close to love. A freedom that was close to love. I remember anyway church suppers and outings, and later, after I left the church, rent and wasteland parties where rage and sorrow sat in the darkness and did not stir, and we ate and drank and talked and laughed and danced and forgot all about the man. We had the liquor, the chicken, the music, and each other, and no need to pretend to be what we were not. There is the freedom that one hears in some gospel songs, for example, and in jazz. In all jazz, and especially in the blues, there is something tart, ironic, authoritative, and double-edged. So then Baldwin goes on in sort of a big chunk of the paragraph to give examples of this in the blues. And then he says this about the explanation of this, and comes back to love. White Americans do not understand the depths out of which such ironic tenacity, the ironic tenacity we find in the blues, comes, but they suspect that the force is sensual, and they are terrified of sensuality and do not any longer understand it. To be sensual, I think, is to respect and rejoice in the force of life itself, and to be present in all that one does, from the effort of loving to the breaking of bread. It will be a great day for America, incidentally, when we begin to eat bread again, instead of the blasphemous and tasteless foam rubber that we have substituted for it. So a lot going on there, but this idea of a freedom close to love is intimately connected to this idea of sensuality, understood very broadly, right? To respect and rejoice in the force of life itself, to be present in all that one does. So keep that in mind. I remind myself, next slide. So this, I want to say, as the third part of our bridge, this really important mentor that Baldwin meets when he's right around the time he's losing his faith, leaving the church. He's introduced to a guy named Buford. He pronounced it Buford Delaney, painter in Greenwich Village. And Baldwin is trying to determine a lot of things about himself, and he has a good friend, Emil Capoya, who meets this guy, Buford Delaney, and thinks Jimmy needs to meet you. And so he gives Jimmy his address, Buford's address, and Baldwin goes to meet this painter. And here's the scene. I want you to think about this idea of sensuality as our link to the last idea is crucial here. So Baldwin, imagine this is the scene, Baldwin walking up the steps to the apartment of this painter, Buford Delaney, just a high schooler at the time. I was terrified once I had climbed those stairs and knocked on that door. A short, round, brown man came to the door and looked at me. He had the most extraordinary eyes I'd ever seen. When he had completed his instant x-ray of my brain, lungs, liver, heart, bowels, and spinal column, and he smiled and said, "Come in," and opened the door. He opened that door all right. Lord, I was to hear Buford sing later, and for many years, opened the unusual door. My running buddy had sent me to the right one, and not a moment too soon. I walked through the door into Buford's colors. You can see some of Delaney's paintings here. On the easel, on the palette, against the wall, sometimes turned to the wall, and sometimes in limbo, covered by white sheets. It was a small studio, but it didn't seem small, with a black pot-bellied stove somewhere near the windows. I remember 2 windows, but there may have only been one. There was a fire escape, which Buford, simply by his presence, had transmuted into the most exclusive terrace in Manhattan or Bombay. So you can just see Baldwin's, again, the sensory experiences walking in to this universe of color. And then he hears. I walked into music. I had grown up with music, but now on Buford's small black record player, I began to hear what I had never dared or been able to hear. Buford never gave me any lectures, but in his studio, because of his presence, I really began to hear Ella Fitzgerald, Ma Rainey, Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, Ethel Waters, Paul Robeson, Lena Horne, Fats Waller, and so on. He goes on like that. So what is it about this guy? What is it about this guy Buford Delaney that ends up being so important to Baldwin? Baldwin talks about, there's a lot of examples of this, but he talks about that, right? Walking into that scene. Just imagine you're a high school kid. Your life is you're trying to figure out your sexual identity. You're trying to figure out all these different things, and you walk into this space. And Buford Delaney, this person who will become a crucial mentor for you. You walk in and you see and you hear that. Baldwin also describes what it was like to go on a walk for Buford Delaney in New York City. He said going on a walk with Buford was like going on a religious pilgrimage. Buford could see a puddle, and the oil kind of in the puddle, and it was a portal to the entire universe. Baldwin said, as he was reflecting on Buford later, he is seeing all the time, and the reality of his seeing caused me to begin to see. So he talks about the ways in which Delaney's just always seeing something that other people aren't seeing. He says, when you sat at the window at Buford later in life, when Delaney's living in France, he would sit at the same window. And the window, Baldwin said, was a kind of universe. And Buford looked out. Each moment he was seeing something new. And so Baldwin says, what is it about this that's so significant? This way, this presence in the world, this artistic presence in the world that he learns from Delaney. Why is this so significant? Here's the way Baldwin explains it. The beauty of his triumph and the proof that it is a real one is that he makes it ours. Perhaps I should not say flatly what I believe, that he is a great painter among the very greatest. But I do know that great art can only be created out of love, and that no greater lover ever held a brush. So there's a way in which Baldwin thinks about the act of love as an act of creation, as an act of creating for oneself and for others an entirely new reality. That's a crucial piece of the bridge. So now if we move forward to Baldwin kind of really thinking about, once he's kind of established himself as he's rising to become one of the most famous writers in the world, he takes some time to reflect on what it means to be an artist. And you'll see these pieces, I think, coming together. Baldwin says that one of my favorite pieces he ever wrote, in 1962, The Creative Process. This is a beautiful, short essay. It's got to be like 400 words or something. What it means to be an artist. And he says that the idea of an artist, right? He says this is about what it means to be an artist, but he says we are all artists. We are all creating all the time. We are creating our own sense of identity and trying to create in the world in one way or another. And so Baldwin says the central part of his understanding of what the role of the artist is to reveal the beloved to himself, and with that revelation make freedom real. So I'm going to come back to that as a philosophy. That's kind of abstract, so let's come back down to the ground. So what does that mean? If we think about now this is where there's this kind of symmetry happening, hopefully, in that the first shadow that I cast in the beginning of the presentation with Baldwin and his father, we're gonna deal with that. And the second shadow that is in some ways related to the story of Eugene, we're gonna deal with that with Giovanni's Room. So Baldwin's first novel is, there it is. Yeah, I skipped a slide. The first novel he writes is Go Tell on the Mountain, and it's an autobiographical novel. Baldwin, it's not like perfectly autobiographical. There's sort of a character that is like a young Baldwin, but he sort of shows up in some of the other characters, composite. And there is a character, though, in the novel, Gabriel, who's very closely modeled after David Baldwin, the man I began the presentation with Baldwin's stepfather. And it's a really complicated novel, but I'm going to tell you, and I don't want to spoil too much, but I want to tell you just a little bit to give you a sense of how this novel helps us understand what it might mean to be a lover in the Baldwinian sense. So in Goat on the Mountain, Gabriel is much like Baldwin's father, and part of what Baldwin's trying to do, he shows this person in the cruelty that I described earlier. And what Baldwin tries to do with this character, though, something he can do in fiction that he couldn't do in real life, is try to build out the backstory. Try to understand, how did my father become the man that I got to know during my life? And so he goes back. So the novel starts you out in Harlem, but then you go back to the South and try to get a sense of where this person came from. And what we find out about Gabriel is that in the South, he was a sinner in all the conventional ways. Drinking, etc., etc. And then he's saved, and he becomes deeply, deeply religious. After he's saved, he commits his most serious sins. Sins that, independent of any religious view, we would identify as about the cruelest sort of behavior we can engage in toward other human beings. I won't give you the details, but that's something we know. Gabriel then comes to New York, and we find him as this holier-than-thou type character, who's a tyrant at home and a tyrant in the pulpit as well, and judgmental of everyone around him, and especially cruel toward his stepson, John, who he calls bastard child. So the novel is basically about this family, and Gabriel, this figure I've just described, has these secrets of these horrible, horrible things that he did. And he thinks those secrets are dead and buried, but they're not. Now, there's a lot more to say about that. I mean, you say, what does that have to do with love? Like, what is going on here? Let me tell you. So the novel is a damning, searing indictment of this guy, Gabriel, and implicitly of Baldwin's father. So fast forward to the 1980s, Baldwin's near the end of his life, and there's a film adaptation made of Go Tell on the Mountain. It's kind of a low budget, but amazing actors, Alfred Woodward, Ving Rhames, Giancarlo Esposito, Paul Winfield. It's worth watching. So the filmmakers asked Baldwin to watch the film and to comment on it for the press. And so he watches the film. And imagine this is like kind of Baldwin, toward the end of his life. He watches the film, 30 years on from writing the novel. And you know what he says about it? He says, now that I think about it, Go Tell on the Mountain is a love song for Daddy. Now, when I saw that press release, I was sitting in the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, right across the street from where Baldwin was born, and I almost fell out of my chair. I was like, what? Like, first of all, I was like looking at this press release thinking this is probably not gonna be that interesting, and I was like, what is he talking about? But love, right, for Baldwin is a very complicated idea, right? Love in this context is about confrontation, right? So central to Baldwin's understanding of what love is confrontational, is coming to terms with that which we would rather not. So if you think about if you think about what it could mean to think about this novel as a love song, the story of Gabriel is a story of a human being who is attempting to avoid his history. He does not want to come to terms with his history. He wants to suppress his history. And the way he does that is by building this armor of holiness around him, and by treating those around him cruelly. Now, the story of Gabriel is the story of all of us, right? And it has a collective political implication. Why do we battle over history so much? Every day in the headlines, we're reading about attempts to suppress history, books being taken out of libraries. Why do we do that? Because we don't want to come to terms with what's there. So Baldwin uses this, and that's all of us. Baldwin uses this story as a way to explore that. So it's a love song, it's a confrontation, but it is a love song in a sense, in this very, very confrontational sense. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. I get carried away. You get me going with James Baldwin, and this is what happens. I'm going to wrap up, I promise, and this will be the last thing. Giovanni's Room. I just want to say something about his second novel. Baldwin, in 1956, publishes a novel about a love affair between a white American named David and an Italian bartender named Giovanni. You can imagine, 1956 publishes this novel. A lot of the people who worked with him on Go Tell on the Mountain refused to work with him on this novel because of its subject matter. And I just want to say this about Giovanni's Room and what it... Baldwin says the novel is about what happens to you when you refuse love. And so I just want to give you just a glimpse of the main character, David, and just a glimpse of the beginning, the enchanted beginning of his love affair with Giovanni, and then this moment of transition as he begins to deny Giovanni's love. So this is Giovanni speaking to David. They sort of meet at a bar. Giovanni's this bartender. They meet. They have this. It's clear they're attracted to each other. And Giovanni, it's about 5 a.m. They've been out all night. And Giovanni says, "Come with me. We will rise at a civilized hour and have a gentle aperitif somewhere, and then a little dinner. It will be much more cheerful like that," he said with a smile. "You will see." We laughed together, teased each other, and so on. And then we're back. We end up in Giovanni's room. Giovanni locked the door behind us, and then for a moment in the gloom, we simply stared at each other with dismay, with relief, and breathing hard. I was trembling. I thought, if I do not open the door at once and get out of here, I am lost. But I knew I could not open the door. I knew it was too late. Soon it was too late to do anything but moan. He pulled me against him, putting himself into my arms as though he were giving me himself to carry, and slowly pulled me down with him to that bed, with everything in me screaming, "No," yet the sum of me sighed, "Yes." So this is a beautiful, beautiful scene. And then, that's part 1. Part 2 of the novel begins this way. This is David speaking as the narrator. "I remember that life in that room seemed to be occurring beneath the sea. Time flowed past indifferently above us. Hours and days had no meaning. And the beginning of our life together held a joy and amazement which was newborn every day. Beneath the joy, of course, was anguish, and beneath the amazement was fear. But they did not work themselves to the beginning until our high beginning was aloes on our tongues. By then, anguish and fear had become the surface on which we slipped and slid, losing balance, dignity, and pride." So remember this beauty he sees in Giovanni. Watch what happens now. "Giovanni's face, which I had memorized so many mornings, noons, and nights, hardened before my eyes, began to give in secret places, began to crack. The light in the eyes became a glitter. The wide and beautiful brow began to suggest the skull beneath. The sensual lips turned inward, busy with the sorrow overflowing from his heart. It became a stranger's face, or it made me so guilty to look on him that I wished it were a stranger's face." So this story is about this character who is, in love in a fundamental way, but he's resisting because he believes that he would rather be safe than to give himself up to this love which he knows is so dangerous. I think what I'm going to do is just conclude with this. Okay, so that's a lot. That was a lot, but let me just wrap up with these 3 thoughts. So what does it mean to love like James Baldwin? I think there are 3 major points I'd like to leave you with. One is Baldwin's idea of what it means to love oneself, right, which is so important if we go back to the beginning of the talk to the ways in which his father grew to hate himself. What does it mean to love yourself? What it means to love yourself, Baldwin says, is to be willing to engage in a kind of ruthless introspection. Always, always reflecting on the ways in which we've constructed our identities in ways that we hope will make us feel safe, Baldwin wants us to always remember that some of that construction is bad for our souls, right? That we might be constructing a sense of self that makes us feel safe for the moment, but we're not being true to who we really are. So that's not something where one day you say, okay, I figured it out, this is who I am. He wants us to engage in that kind of introspection every single moment. But also there's this idea that Baldwin says that one of the things you have to do if you love someone is you have to engage in this confrontation, right? He says, if I love you, I have to make you conscious of what you cannot see. So a central part of Baldwin's conception of love is to confront those who we care about, right? To reveal the beloved to themselves. I often tell people to be loved by James Baldwin, or to be loved in a Baldwinian spirit, might not be very pleasant, but it's important. And finally, this sense of community, what does it mean to love in community? Part of it is what I was describing, the scene in Harlem, right? The ways in which we need each other. Love and freedom are not things that we can experience really by ourselves. We have to experience them with others. So that's part of it, but also this sense in which Baldwin wants us to go back to the last quote on the sheet, right? It's if we love something, if we love an institution, if we love our country, if we love any group of which we're part, we have to be willing to criticize it perpetually, to make it better than it is. Thanks for your attention, I really appreciate it. All right, so we have a few minutes for those of you who are in the classes that are here. We have a few minutes for questions, comments. And also if you have something on your Valentine I didn't get to or you don't know how it's related, we can talk about that. But yeah, the floor is open, and we do have a roving microphone, so you can just raise your hand. And, yeah, Colin. I'll wait for the mic real quick.
Hello.
Hey.
I've always thought of love as the rejection of hate, and maybe even vice versa. What would you say would be Baldwin's perspective on that?
Yeah, I think there's something to that for Baldwin. In the essay about one of the most famous essays about his father, Notes of a Native Son, he has this beautiful line that I'll paraphrase, where he says, one of the reasons that people cling to their hates is because they know if they let go, they'll be forced to deal with pain. And so I think that for Baldwin, one of the central parts of Baldwin's understanding of love is that love is a space of vulnerability. Love is a space where you are in the breach. And so I think that for Baldwin, there is a sense in which, hatred, right? A lot of manifestations of hatred, Baldwin thinks, he's always interested in the grave question of self. Any sort of manifestation of hatred we see in our politics or in our personal relationships, he wants us to get beneath that. There's a grave question of self underneath it, right? And so I think part of what he would say, I think, is that some of what we're doing when we hate is we are trying to protect ourselves. We're trying to make ourselves feel safe. And that is the opposite of love. So yes, Colin, I think that's right on. Yeah, Cameron.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got a quote on here that says, "Societies never know it, but the war of an artist with his society is a lover's war." And I was just hoping you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that comes from the creative process essay I mentioned in 1962. And, it's a really interesting essay because in part he starts it out, I'm going to talk to Professor Cottrell's leadership class tomorrow about that essay. And part of it is he starts it out, it's like, look, what I'm about to describe here is really important. And it's really important not just for someone who conceives of like their vocation as, or their life as an artist, but it's important for all of us. But he also says, I do think there are ways in which what I'm describing as essential to a good life, this kind of understanding of love and this understanding of creativity, is you can't run a society completely with that, right? And so he sort of differentiates between what he calls responsible members of society and the artists. And so I say all that to say that, you know, Baldwin says fundamentally the way he's conceiving of art in that essay is to constantly be challenging us to reimagine reality. And that every change, though, that we're proposing, every change that the artist is asking us to imagine is a proposal of death for something that currently exists, right? Every change is a kind of death. And so Baldwin says, you know, there's a kind of way in which, you know, he uses this kind of martial metaphor of war, right? There's a kind of war with the world as it currently exists when we use our imaginations to dream of something new. And so, but he says, you know, when it's done right, it's done out of love, right? It's done in a way that is honoring, it's trying to make people better, it's trying to make our community better. And so, yeah, it's a war, but it's a lover's war. It's a special kind of war. Yeah. Other questions, comments? Yeah, Nolan.
One of the definitions that stuck with me the most about love and what it means is it's from Plotinus, actually, from the 3rd century. But at any rate, he talked about how love is ultimately the desire to become one with something that you find beautiful. That it might vary with each person, but it's to become one with something. By the sound of it, you think that the most important part of love for Baldwin was conflict, trying to, with difficulty, become one with something. Do you think that is necessarily the case, that sometimes love can be a very easy thing, that you're not necessarily challenged?
I knew you were going to quote somebody like whatever guy you said. I mean, I do think that is okay, that works. I mean, I do think in this idea of union, right? I think Baldwin would certainly be fine with that. I mean, I think that part of this is, it doesn't, you know, I also think it's really important, and I didn't include, I felt like, well, next time I give this off a little more positive than I had in this one. This was really heavy all the way through. But one of the things I talk about in other, you know, sort of meditations on love with Baldwin is the ways in which when we see love working, right, in a way that is more easy or it seems more like inviting and welcoming. And so if you think about some of Baldwin's most important friendships with people like Lorraine Hansberry, there's a kind of love there that I think is what, you know, Plotinus, is that that guy? Yes, I mean, there's a kind of way in which they sort of, you know, even like right when they first lay eyes on each other, they know like, oh, you're gonna be my friend. You're gonna have my back and I'm gonna have yours. And they fight and they argue a lot, but they love each other in this deep way, and every conversation ends in laughter, even when, you know, she's kicking him out because she thinks, you know, he needs help, you know. And so, yeah, there's that, I think, as well. And Baldwin's own, you know, love affairs, which almost always were very, very complicated, but there is a kind of moment, there are moments in them that are this kind of union with something beautiful and a mutual recognition of that beauty. What else? Any other questions, comments from the crowd? Okay, well, we have lots of cookies and like way too much punch, so drink some punch. I will hang out, and a lot of my students will hang out. So drink some coffee, eat some cookies, bring cookies to a friend, bring a Valentine to a friend. Thank you again.